Right now, we're in the final stretch of Warzone leading up to year 1. As of last week, it was 11 months on the dot, so we're in that final countdown of sorts. And as such, I was reminiscing on some times here in the past, what seems like both a long and very quick 11 months within Warzone. And while looking at footage, seeing some changes, I realized there's actually been a handful of fundamental changes that were rather big that you may not have even remembered happened. So today I want to take a look at some of those changes that you likely forgot about within Warzone. As we go along, let me know your thoughts down below. Do you guys remember these changes? If so, did you like them, dislike them at the time, and where do you stand on them right now? Love to get your thoughts and feedback down below. As well, if you are new to the channel, do be sure that subscribe button. We're on that road to 400,000 subscribers, and we'll keep you up to date with all things Warzone, Cold War, and anything COD related, especially as we round up to that 1 year mark for Warzone and what may follow afterwards. So if you're interested in joining the community, I'd love to have you. That said, let's jump into it. So firstly, I want to start out with some of the biggest changes made to the game, which incidentally are also changes that were made right after the launch of the game. And the difference is gameplay are pulled from either the launch era of the game right before the launch at our pre-release capture session, or just slightly after. So in about a month period before and after the launch of Warzone. The first of which being the fact that Warzone actually launched trios only. Fundamentally, Warzone was a bit different because at launch, if you didn't have a squad to play, you were kind of a disadvantage here. I remember this caused quite a stir in the community where people were like, well, I don't have two other people, I play solo primarily, and other scenarios where it was one person missing or they played in a squad of 4 where they were leaving somebody out at all times. Now, I'll be honest, it's a bit odd to me, even that knowing the power of Call of Duty's name, mixing in free-to-play and the craze of BR that was building up for years at that point, that only trios was launched at that point, but that's what we ended up getting. After a few weeks, we had the introductions of solos, duos, and quads, and all was kind of right with the world for Warzone, but initially, those that wanted to try it out, it was either you versus the world or playing when you had friends online. I'm glad that's no longer the case. The second big change here that came up with this was something of kill credit. Now, this seems pretty straightforward right now if you think about it because it works as intended, but another big change that was made rather quickly was how kill credit was dispersed. Pre-launch and right after launch, if I'm not mistaken, the kill credit was awarded to those whoever cleaned up the kill, rather than whoever knocked the player ends up getting that kill, or in some truer senses, which you may not encounter all that much because they are kind of rare in how they pop up, whoever does the most damage or lethal damage, that's who ends up getting the kill, even if you ended up putting a couple of extra shots in. But pre-launch, if this change wasn't made, this could have skewed things incredibly. Your kill records could look a lot different. If a team was being knocked and then cleanups were the true indicator, you'd probably have a lot more people unhappy. You do all the work and then your boy with no gun skill in your squad gets the kill credit. Would be rough scenes. Another big change that was made was actually the price to loadout drops. This is one that I think was needed initially at least, though it may have gone a little bit overboard depending on who you end up asking. At launch, loadout drops were actually only 6,000 in cash as opposed to their current 10,000 in price. They were changed once before that 10,000 mark to have a sort of middle ground, but it didn't last too long. That price jump went from 6,000 to I believe it was 8,000, and now it's where it is at right now at 10,000. It's been there for a while. But this was something that you could absolutely loot a small area and get a loadout drop right off the rip. Even smaller areas like the immediate area that my squad and I jumped to right after launch was that of Hills behind Promenade. That little town on the coast, it was a very viable place to land because you had minimal that you had to loot to end up getting that 6,000, and there was almost always a buy station there with players that really didn't challenge that area all that much. Now, while I agree that it made loadouts a little bit too easy to obtain at that $6,000 price point, which made it a main argument against the true battle royale embodiment, that you'd have something that isn't quite as random as BR should promote. That loadout system is something that was what made Warzone unique, that you could control some of that fundamentals. It was just about finding that right balance between having control too early on versus too late. Because if you look at it, $10,000 for solos is still rather hard to obtain. It's absolutely doable, but it's much harder than trios or quads. I'd be curious to know if the loot scaling is 1-to-1 here, because it doesn't really feel like that from the limited time that I play solos and duos as opposed to trios and quads, but I think a decent compromise here for that would have been to see that $6,000 or $8,000 price point stick for, say, solos and duos, and then have that price point up to $10,000 for trios and quads. But the official reasoning behind that was that Infinity Ward didn't want to have to make the players memorize too many different numbers. They wanted to keep it uniform and easy to remember, which I understand to an extent, but I also don't think that one subtle deviation would annihilate somebody's memory. But anyways, the next change here was that of no proper spectating feature. Another feature that's been a great addition here, but I suppose wasn't integral to making a working game for the launch, was a proper spectating mode. Now, it's kind of second nature at this point that if you die, you can spectate the next player, re-queue, or exit to the menus. But at launch and beforehand, there actually was no way to do that. It was just the option to back out to the main menus. While you could technically still spectate a player with that after action menu that pops up, it was only a spectate of that team and of that player that killed you, and there was no way to switch between teams or be able to control who you spectate on that team. That functionality was just an automated switch with an after action overlay on top of that, and no way to actually control what was under that UI. This was added in relatively soon after launch, and now it's a nice way to check in on the validity of a player, where say kill cams can't be in much of an accurate depiction. Kill cams are sped up and aren't one-to-one in terms of real-time movement and tracking. It's just a simple playback process that gives you some relative information about the player, whereas spectating them is actually real-time and accurate in the point of view to the player. So if you're suspect of somebody, you think they're cheating, the kill cam isn't exactly what you'd base that on. You'll always see more snaps in kill cams than actual in-game footage, but if you spectate somebody, that'll give you a little bit more of an understanding. Now, the interesting part about those changes that we just mentioned is that every single one of those differences were from the launch period, within the first month or so, but the next ones we're going to talk about were some fundamental changes that were made throughout the year that you may have forgotten about. So I want to start with one that I think was perhaps the most influential in gameplay, that being cash drops and amounts in caches were adjusted. When the game launched up until about mid-April to early May, cash drops out of crates were guaranteed, meaning that whether you opened a blue chest, a contract crate for say scavenger, or even a legendary crate, you were guaranteed some kind of money out of them. But come that mid-April to early May timeframe, that was actually adjusted, in which firstly, the amount of cash in drops were reduced in terms of that total, which lessened the totals and how fast you could acquire enough money to purchase things in game. But also later on down the line, we saw a secondary update that actually changed to the point where you're not guaranteed cash out of every single crate now, but instead you have a chance of getting cash spawns in crates. This changed gameplay drastically, not only just for say things like initial investments into utility like loadout crates, UAVs, armor, and anything in between, but also in late game or getting out of a pinch situation, it could be hard. When you're looking for cash to say buy back a teammate, you were good to go if you heard the crate spawn beforehand. Now it's a matter of, well, I hope there's any cash in there at all. So definitely a big change that you may not actively think about, but was much different beforehand. Another big change here were the circle times that were adjusted around the end of April here. I think it was right before May, but beforehand, whenever Warzone launched, this might seem like a lot here. I'm just going to run down these real quick and put them up on screen for you guys to check out as well. The first starting time frame that you had for a zone was 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The first close was 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The second zone had a pre-timer of 1:30 and a close timer of 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The third reveal and close was 1 minute and 15 seconds and 2 minutes. The fourth reveal and close was 1 minute and 1:30 seconds. Then fifth was 1 minute and 1 minute. Sixth was 45 seconds both ways. Seventh zone was 30 seconds and 45 seconds. And then the eighth zone was 1 minute and 30, in which it would just simply close in on the player. But as of April 29th, it was updated to change those a little bit, where the first zone had a pre and close of 3 minutes and 30 seconds and 4 minutes and 30 seconds, a change of a minute in difference there. The second had a zone of 1 minute and 30 seconds and a 3 minute and 40 second difference, change on those close, and all the closing values here throughout will be different as well, in which third changed to 2 minutes and 50 seconds, the fourth changed to 1 minute and 50 seconds, the fifth changed to 1 minute and 10, the sixth changed to 50 seconds, the seventh changed to 50 seconds, and then the eighth started at 10 seconds and then moved down to 5 before the movement of the zone. So functionally speaking, you may not notice these changes much outside of the first zone difference. What's different with the first zone as opposed to others is the actual pacing of the zone itself. It's the only zone that you cannot outrun on foot. So if you have a long way to go to zone, make sure that you're of course looking out for yourself and giving enough of a head start you can make it out of there, or have a vehicle relatively around you. That might be something that is common knowledge, but if you don't actively think about it, you might not realize that it was actually a really big change from launch. But these changes were made in order to adopt, I guess, a bit of a different pacing for the game overall, and perhaps I can't remember pre-April much, but I do think that these changes weren't all that bad, but fundamentally were different from the intended timing for each zone. The next change I want to talk about actually kind of goes right into that one here. This one somewhat discussed with that 8th and final zone, but if you look at Warzone's final circle now, as opposed to what launched beforehand, we ended up seeing two different ways for the matches to go about ending. The first zone at the launch of Warzone simply shrunk until the entire map was covered in gas, but in an effort to keep the fights going and combat against potential heal-offs, perhaps say if somebody was above and below, the zone now actually moves, which gives further potential potential for gunfights in motion rather than the stationary heal-offs. Outside of, say, the stim glitches that you can see, this absolutely can make a difference in the outcomes of matches, which change the endgame potential drastically. The next change that you may not notice was that of the pricing changes on self-revives and buybacks. This change was actually made not too long ago. I think it was probably like 3 or 4 months ago at this point, but launching up until the pre-adjustment period, self-revives and buybacks both cost $4,500 in cash. So a little bit more compared to where they are now, where the current pricing is $4,000 for each. So now you actually have quite a few choices if you have $4,000 in cash. You can get something like a self-revive, you could buy back your teammate, or you get a UAV, which gives you that extra knowledge. So if somebody's backseat gaming and being real annoying in that party chat, you can just buy a UAV instead of buying them back. The second to last change I want to talk about here is that of vehicle nerfs that were made over the course of the year. There were a lot of them, but the biggest was probably that of the cargo truck, or the Big Bertha. If you remember back to around launch, this was actually a big strat that players had, was just simply taking the cargo truck and roaming around the map with it, because not only one did it have extra health where you couldn't be blown up by one singular explosive with it, but also the turning radius was incredibly good, and it was incredibly mobile and agile for a vehicle that is that big. Way different than what it is right now. And especially given the fact that you couldn't really shoot through the glass in the back unless you have pinpoint precision accuracy, you basically could just back up and start driving around Verdansk in reverse and be unstoppable. So that was an absolutely necessary change, I think, but a big one no less. The final thing I want to talk about is one that is kind of self-explanatory, but revisits a little bit of what you may have forgotten about, that being weapon balance in terms of some weapons that you may not actively think about. If you remember back to launch, the Odin was actually a 2-shot, 3-shot kill depending on if they had armor versus no armor, and also the EBR-14 was basically the DMR from Cold War's integration that was incredibly short-lived. It was taken care of much quicker than the EBR from Cold War's integration, but of course you also had things throughout the year like the dual snake shot magnums, the Grau, other weapons that were just absolutely unstoppable. Those, of course, were all changed throughout the year. But I think that's about where we want to bring it here, and that's 10 changes that you may have forgotten about over the course of the last year within Warzone. So, that said, let me know your thoughts down below. Do you guys remember any of these changes? How many of them did you remember? And how do you feel about these changes? Let me get your thoughts and feedback down below, but hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to drop a like down below, and of course, if you're new to the channel, make sure you guys subscribe so you don't miss a single thing regarding all things Warzone, Cold War, and anything COD related, especially as we round into Year 2 of Warzone coming up very soon. If you also want to follow me over on Twitter and Instagram, those are the best places to get connected outside of YouTube. Probably live on both those. If you guys want to strike up a conversation, ask me a question, whatever it may be, that link is down there in the description below. That said, thanks so much for watching. My name has been Espresso. I'll see you guys later. Take care and peace.